Hey, hope y'all are doing well. Welcome to episode 8 of Next Gen. I'm excited you joined me here today. And for this episode, I want to talk about some interesting developments that we've had over the past few weeks. Before we get to that, I kind of want to set the stage for you a little bit. So I've titled this episode something along the lines of Have iPads finally become computers? And to give you context for this title, back in 2010, when Steve Jobs first announced the iPad was marketed as being somewhere in between smartphones and computers. Basically, it was a device that would still have a nice big screen, so you could still do things on a lot easier than you would a smartphone, but it would still have the operating system of a smartphone. So it'd be this kind of interesting in between category. But ever since 2010, things have changed dramatically since then. Ever since Tim Cook took over Apple and has been working on the iPad, we started seeing the iPad taking a direction more toward trying to be a sort of like a pseudo laptop. We started getting things like new multitasking features and new software features and all these new interesting developments, cursor support and attachable keyboards and styluses and all these things. And it's kind of brought up the question for people because it was a question that Apple was planning in a lot of people's minds. Could the iPad become a computer? And I think nowadays, I think we can really start asking that question a lot more because since even those days, we've had a lot more developments since then. The iPad has been continuously developing new software features. As a matter of fact, recently, Apple finally launched not full versions, but starter versions of Final Cut Pro as well as Logic Pro, actual professional apps for the iPad, which we haven't really had too much of in the past. Google recently started investing more time into tablets with things like the Pixel tablet. Recently, Amazon came out with the Fire Max, which is basically a bigger version of their Fire HD tablets with a keyboard and everything. And you can buy tablets upward of 15 inches, like Samsung's Galaxy Tab S8 Ultra. And I know that this video title is geared a bit more towards iPads, but I really want to I want to talk in relation to iPads, but I think a lot of what I say in this episode could apply to tablets as a whole. And to figure out whether tablets slash iPads have become computers, I want to focus on a few main areas that I think really separate computers from tablets. So the first of these categories is productivity. One of the, from my experience, one of the big things that really sets apart computers from just a normal tablet is the fact that it's a lot easier to multitask, to get things done, to actually make use of the software that the device is running. Ever since the iPad actually started to get more productivity features, they basically had to do it in the form of things like split view, where you just put two apps side by side and you can resize them a little bit, or you have the slide over, where you have like the small version of the app you have over your split screen and things like that. Since then, we have gotten things like multi window support, which admittedly Android tablets have also had for a long time now, but they've also had features like monitor support. Basically, you could plug into a computer into an external display, and it would display whatever was shown on the display onto that display you just plugged in. You could usually these would have multiple different options. You could basically mirror your display, or you could have it display just the big display. You could have it extend the display, where you could just put whatever you're doing and use it as an extended workspace. And recently, even though back in the day you couldn't really do that with an iPad other than just mirror your display, things have changed for that as well. iPads, I believe last year, I believe it was iPadOS 16. It's kind of hard to keep track at this point, but that allowed again for external display support. You could plug in an iPad to an external display, and you could have different apps basically extending across your iPad and your external display. Now that all that being said, there have been a few concessions made for tablets. Let's take the iPad, for example. Apple technically did allow for Windows support and monitor support with limitations. The iPad can basically run with a monitor up to 8 apps at one time, and I believe it's actually hard capped at that only. Basically, you only have four apps on the iPad, 4 apps on an external display, and that's it. In addition to that, we've also had things. In addition to that, the iPad can only do this on M1 or M2 powered devices. Anything running on an A series chip can't do this. And then in a sort of, I guess we could probably say hardware is sort of a subcategory of this, but I still want to put it into the category of productivity because I think it just kind of adds, I think kind of falls a lot into the productivity category. Basically, a lot of computers tend to have a lot bigger displays that make it easier to do things on your screen. You can more easily see what's going on. You can have more apps open at one time more comfortably. And you also have support for things like keyboard cases and external mice and trackpads that you could use to interact with your devices. Now, laptops have always had this built in, of course, but iPads have always just been kind of a tablet on their own. The thing is, a keyboard and a mouse, like physically, makes it a lot easier to interact with because you're actually interacting with a physical object in front of you rather than just touching things on a display. Sometimes an on-screen keyboard, one, it takes up screen real estate on your device, and two, it just doesn't feel as effortless to type on compared to a physical keyboard, having the actual physical feedback of an actual wired or wireless keyboard. And similar thing goes for a mouse. Sometimes a mouse is a bit more precise and it makes it a bit easier to work with rather than just using a touchscreen. You think using a touchscreen would be easier to do, and in some cases it is. But there are times where using an external mouse or trackpad is just a lot easier. And here's the thing. If you didn't have an external keyboard or external mouse, how can you go to the link in the description and subscribe to my email list? Well, that was pretty effortless, right? But anyway, now that we've talked a little bit about productivity, I want to talk a little bit about software. I think this is one of the big cases that a lot of people make whenever they say that the iPad isn't yet a computer. That's because not only one, do you not have a lot of the software that's otherwise available on a computer, but two, the software that is available usually isn't as powerful as what you get on a full computer. Let's take Adobe Photoshop, for example. That was a software that a lot of people have been asking for on the iPad because it had been available on computers for such a long time. And considering that one of the big reasons you buy an iPad is to use things like the Apple Pencil and use it as a sort of on-screen drawing tablet, then it kind of made sense to have something like Photoshop. Well, eventually, Adobe did come out with Photoshop for the iPad, but what disappointed a lot of people was that it just wasn't quite as powerful. You didn't get all the features that you would have gotten in the full desktop version. And this is basically a very similar story for a lot of similar apps. Take Apple's Final Cut and Logic Pro that they recently came out with on the iPads. It's just not as powerful of a version that you're going to get on the desktop. It's missing a lot of core features. And that is because it's being completely rebuilt for the iPad, but that's kind of my point. You're having to rebuild it for a completely different device, a completely different operating system, a completely different use case. You're buying an iPad for the touchscreen. You're buying a Mac for the keyboard and trackpad. In kind of a loose sense, I mean, not exclusively, but in terms of use cases, you're buying a computer to use a keyboard and a trackpad, and you're buying an iPad to specifically take advantage of the touchscreen. So you're basically having to build the same app for two completely different experiences. The thing when you buy a PC or a MacBook or whatever, a full power laptop, you're able to take advantage of the software because it's the full power software. It's the full software that the developer originally intended. They didn't have to rebuild it for a specific other device, and they're not limited by the operating system. I'll get to that in a little bit, but you're basically able to use all of the core features. And it's actually something a lot of people find ironic because the iPad is such a powerful device. There really isn't an app on the App Store that can actually take advantage of the iPad's power in general. And that kind of takes me into my third point, which is the operating system. The thing about full power computers is that operating systems on full laptops and desktop computers and what have you tend to be more open. Basically, you're not locked down by any sort of restrictions that the operating system has. In a sense, you're you're basically just able to develop however you want pretty much on those devices. The thing about mobile operating systems, which is what tablets tend to run on, is that they have locked down operating systems. So they're built to work on certain architectures and protocols that you wouldn't otherwise be restricted to on a full power computer. Let's take browsers, for example. If you were to get an iPad and you were to download something like Chrome or Firefox, those are not the actual Chrome and Firefox that you get on a computer. Those are built on Apple's WebKit, which is basically the same thing that Safari runs on. So all you're really doing is just getting a different version of Safari with every browser you install on an iPad. That's one of the big restrictions of something like an iPad because you're having to build it all on certain architectures and systems that are pre-installed in the operating system. The big restriction in terms of the operating system is that you can only download apps from app stores. This is also one of the big complaints about iPads because you can't sideload apps from other app stores. You're restricted to Apple's App Store, which is supposedly changing in iOS 17. But whenever you have a computer, you can just go to a developer's website who makes a piece of software for your computer and just download it straight onto your computer. You don't have to go through any particular app store to do it. You just go to the web and you download it. In the case of something like Linux, you just type it into your command terminal and it downloads on your computer. So in general, you just don't get the full power that you get from an operating system. You don't even really seem to get the level of customization that you'd otherwise get from a computer. This is why a lot of times software just tends to not be as powerful because you're so limited by what the operating system provides that you can't really program anything to take full advantage of it. So, all that being said, I think it's pretty safe to say that iPads still don't really stack up to computers yet. And honestly, I think the operating system is kind of a big limiting factor. And, because of all that, I really do think that at this point, computers and tablets are still going to coexist for the foreseeable future. I think that companies like Apple and Samsung are going to continue to build their tablets as its own separate device, its own separate experience. I think tablets in general are always going to be touch first, stylus first, all of that, because that's kind of what tablets have always been made for ever since the iPad back in 2010. That was intended to be a middle device that you use as a touchscreen, just a big, basically just a glorified big phone without the ability to make calls. And Macs PCs, things like that, I think will always tend to be more computer focused. Yes, computers have touch screens, but that's not always going to be as good as what you get from an iPad. The iPad is always going to have more of a touch first interface, while Macs will always be power and just keyboard and mouse support first. But here's the thing, if Apple really wants to make the iPad like an actual computer, I think at this point they really need to try to do something to make them more distinct from Macs. And until they do that, I think that I think at this point they're just going to kind of end up living in the shadow of computers. They're always going to be impersonating them without ever really becoming them. So I think at this point they either try to do something to make people want to buy them over a Mac, or just fully embrace the whole computer aspect and have iPadOS develop into a more open, powerful operating system. That's all I have for this week. Thank you so much for joining me. If you enjoyed it, be sure to follow the podcast or subscribe or wherever you're listening from. Be sure to join my email list and leave a comment on this episode and let me know what you think and share your thoughts. But until next week, See you then. Adios.